Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Self-Sovereign Identity for B2B Transactions. So with the recent COVID pandemic, it's really amplified the need for trusted identities, trusted digital identities for B2B transactions. So in cases that where typically businesses will rely on a fixed number of partners and suppliers, they've now realized that they need a lot more flexibility, and they're required to work with a lot more people globally that they've never worked with before. So things such as onboarding new organizations or partners, provisioning them with accesses that could be digital or physical, and even ensuring legal and compliance requirements are all musts to not necessarily scale anymore, but survive in today's rapidly changing landscape. So we founded SSI Toronto to talk about self-sovereign identity. We called it SSI Toronto just because we're based in Toronto, but due to the situation, we've turned them into online webinars, which have been actually quite great because it's allowed us to expand the community and talk about self-sovereign identity on a global scale. So it's really been fantastic. In today's webinar, we'll have a discussion with our guests who are quite well versed in B2B transactions, specifically in aerospace, defense, and supply chain sectors. So we'll discuss how self-sovereign identity and verifiable credentials, an important component of self-sovereign identity, can be used in these environments. So we'll start off with a discussion on ecosystems. So the speakers have quite a bit of experience working in all sorts of different and complex ecosystems, and ecosystems are really something that needs to be in place to deploy collaborative technologies such as self-sovereign identity. So we'll also discuss how to use verifiable credentials to safely and quickly onboard employees, contractors, vendors, suppliers to your organization. We'll also touch on how to use self-sovereign identity for access management and identification. And the last topic, which I'm looking forward to, is all about how to use SSI for provenance, traceability, but also to improve data quality and reputations within your networks. If anyone has questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A functionality on Zoom. So if there are questions that are relevant to the discussion that we're having in the moment, we'll try to pick them up as we go through. If not, we're going to allocate a bit of time at the end, probably around 12:50, the last 10 minutes, to go over any outstanding questions. So just a short blurb about ourselves. So we're Northern Block. We are the founders of the Self-Sovereign Identity Toronto series. We started off in the blockchain space in 2017 as a technology service company. We've worked on all sorts of use cases with all sorts of different organizations. Our first kind of experience in the digital identity space was when we completed a proof of concept with the government of Ontario a couple of years ago, just to showcase how a blockchain could be used to give citizens back control of their personal information. Last year, we got into the self-sovereign identity space, which is a little different than what we did with the government of Ontario, when we had to implement this technology with one of our clients here, VeriTransfer, inside of a verifiable data exchange platform. We're also working on an SSI implementation with VeriTX, our proud partners, who we're fortunate to have the founder and president of VeriTX on this webinar with us today. So we'll discuss that in more details as we go through. And we're also quite involved in different industry associations with the DIAC, the Trust Over IP Foundation, and we're working inside the Institute of International Finance on a trust framework for digital identity. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation about using SSI for B2B transactions. So let's start with some intros, and I'll start with you, Jim. So we've been partnered with you and your whole team, Jim, for a little while now, taking your massive vision of a decentralized marketplace for aerospace parts and turning it into a reality, both with really innovative technical architecture, but also collaborating on strategy and go-to-market plans. So we're really focused on adoption. So Jim, can you give us a bit of an overview on yourself and VeriTX and its mission?
Sure. Thank you, Matthew, for the kind introduction. It is funny that the slide does say SSI Toronto. I live in Buffalo, and I often tell people in Buffalo that the light shines very brightly across Lake Ontario. And that light is really the innovation light that's just shining in Toronto. What an exciting ecosystem you guys have there. And I'm proud to be partnered with some Toronto-based companies. So thank you, Mathieu. A little bit about myself. James Regenor, I'm a retired colonel in the Air Force, spent 31 years roughly in the Air Force, 25 years of that flying airplanes. Out of that, what I found later in my career was, as I ran a large logistics organization, that I was always starving for parts. So when I got out, I had the opportunity to go work for an aerospace company called Moog here in Buffalo. And they happened to acquire a 3D print business, which really got me thinking, how can I apply this new technology of 3D printing to help solve some of the pain and heartache I had as a commander, always suffering for spare parts? And what we did was we worked left to right. We worked, right to left to design some scenarios that would allow us to really start to leverage some new technologies. We stumbled really upon blockchain as we started looking at how you could securely send a part out to the point of use and then manufacture it at the time of need. In an aerospace, provenance is required. So a part has to have a yellow tag to say it's airworthy. Without that yellow tag and without the provenance that's associated with it, that part is a paperweight. It's worthless. It's of no value because you can't put it on an airplane. And which is good because there's a high consequence of failure. If you have bad parts on an airplane, they fail, then the airplane falls out of the sky. Not so good. So we put together, I worked at Moog for a while. We put together some technology around blockchain and around 3D printing and some other technology convergences. We have a little bit of AI worked in there and a little bit of AR in the solution that we're bringing to market now with Mathieu and with Northern Block. But what we quickly realized was the importance of one, having a data integrity rail that blockchain provided, two, having a process integrity rail that blockchain would provide, and then three, having a rail to record the performance integrity. So we built around these three integrities. We did some proofs of concepts. We were able to compress supply chain lead times from 265 days on an Air Force part down to 6 hours. On a commercial airline from 40 days down to 1 hour. And we actually did that one while the airplane was in flight. So the part was waiting for it when it landed. So VeriTX, it allows people or companies or the Air Force to increase their mission capable rates, reduce these long lead times, reduce costs, and also mitigate counterfeit, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. But there's a lot of counterfeit parts that permeate the aerospace market. It's about 3 billion annually, and with new technology like 3D printing, that number will go up as more parts are counterfeited. So something you need to be leery of. There are some accidents in the recent past that were attributed to counterfeit parts and them failing. And then so far this year, VeriTX has received pretty good traction. We've got 3 DoD that working on creating digital supply chains for the U.S. government. So VeriTX itself, when implemented, will save thousands of hours and reduce maintenance errors. Mathieu mentioned a little bit about COVID. What we're seeing, I'll just hit this and we can talk about it and unpack it as the panel goes on, but we're seeing an acceleration to digital supply chain. I would say before COVID, people were kind of dipping a toe in the water, but now a lot of companies have jumped in. In fact, there was a Deloitte study that came out just this past week with better than 50% of the companies participating in some sort of blockchain event right now. So it is coming to the mainstream. The tools and the things we'll talk about today, especially around sovereign identity, are very important in order to create this new internet of value or internet of trust. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim, for the intro. And maybe I'll just shortly, Subhashis, just throw it over to you. So Subhashis is our Chief Delivery Officer at Northern Block, has worked on various projects of ours. Could you just give kind of a brief overview of what makes self-sovereign identity such a perfect fit for VeriTX and other similar B2B use cases?
Thanks, Mathieu, and welcome everybody for joining the conference. And yeah, absolutely. It's been great working on supply chain and more recently on VeriTX. And VeriTX is a 100% distributed marketplace with a very, very complex ecosystem which is serving a very critical requirement like Jim talked about, supplying new and used parts. And as Jim mentioned, one of the key drivers of supplying these new parts is building trust, reputation, and also speed, which he demonstrated about how to save speed and enable these transactions in a frictionless way. So if we look at SSI, which is the digital identity of this ecosystem members, SSI provides the identity and the verifiable credentials. Now, these credentials need to be trusted. If the supplier of the parts, if the part has to be trusted, the supplier of the part has to be first trusted. Mm-hmm. So SSI provides that ability to trust the part and the supplier of that, right? Because in VeriTX, these credentials are issued by issuers who are trusted by the ecosystem and by peers, and when these credentials are through these issuers, they are trusted by the other members of the ecosystem, and that's one very important part. The other part, which was mentioned about speed and frictionless. So speed in today's digital world is extremely important. Credentials have been used before, but the pace at which they get verified, whether the issuers exist, are they still in business, have been big question marks, which delays the verification of transactions, right? So SSI is enabling exactly that, enabling to verify the credentials, verify these credentials digitally, right? So the verifier can get the credentials from somebody who is trying to do business with you, and enables that, right? So not only in aerospace, I believe I've been working in supply chain for many years prior to this. The SSI technology absolutely is of extreme value, I believe, for any B2B transactions.
Thank you, Subhashis, and we'll get obviously deeper into that throughout this conversation today. And the last intro, last but not least, Dr. Mary Lacity, who is a professor at the Sam Walton College of Business, which is part of the University of Arkansas. Mary also leads the Blockchain Center of Excellence within the university. So thank you, Mary, for doing this today with us. Do you mind just giving everyone a brief intro on yourself and what you've been up to in the blockchain and SSI space?
Sure, thank you, Matthew, and I'll add my good wishes and welcomes to everybody else. So I've been at the University of Arkansas for 2 years now. I was brought here, as Matthew mentioned, to direct the Blockchain Center of Excellence. And we really have a dual mission. One is on the education side of blockchain-enabled solutions. And to that front, we've got full curriculum, undergraduate and graduate curriculum on blockchains. I just started a class yesterday. I have 37 students enrolled, and I think some of them I see on our participant list here today. And on the research front, we really work closely with our enterprise partners. So we have 10 executive advisory member firms. Those are companies like Walmart and Tyson, McKesson, JB Hunt, IBM, Microsoft, Ernst & Young. And they propose the research topics that we investigate. And Matthew, I can tell you that we very infrequently talk about technology. We're primarily talking about how you create shared solutions in an ecosystem environment. And there's a lot of challenges to that. So we'll pick up the conversation there. But that's essentially what we do. We do research and education, and I'm going to call it blockchain-enabled solutions, because just like Jim's a perfect example of this. You know, there's no point in talking about a blockchain company that doesn't exist, or what does it mean? Really, we're talking about unique solutions that happen to be well suited for blockchain technologies for some aspects of it.
Thank you, Mary. I completely agree with you. I think the technology should be the last part of the conversation. And I think that leads quite nicely into the topic of ecosystems that we want to discuss. So since you work quite closely with many large companies through the Blockchain Center of Excellence, I guess one of the first things you do with them when you're looking to unlock value is just discuss how the ecosystems look like. And I guess within the ecosystems, what the different roles are, what the different governance mechanisms are. And the reason why I would like you to maybe talk a bit more about how you approach ecosystems is that for a technology like self-sovereign identity to have all its value or achieve all its promise, it needs to be working in a collaborative environment or an ecosystem. So would you mind talking a bit about how you approach ecosystem design with the various companies or folks that you're in conversations with?
Sure, no, absolutely. So at the Blockchain Center of Excellence, we've looked at 8 different ways to kind of organize an ecosystem, and I'll just really talk about 2 of the most common ones. So the question people ask are, it's kind of 2 parts along the journey. One is, who and how do you create a minimal viable ecosystem to develop a minimal viable product? And then once you do that and you put it into production, how do you scale that? How do you get a critical mass of adoption for network effects? So the 2 most common models we find is a founder-led model and a consortia-led model. And a lot of people like to criticize the founder-led models because they say, oh, it's too centralized, but that's not what we're finding at all. What we're really finding is if you have a founder that is a neutral person in the ecosystem, so they're not in direct competition with some of the key players you're trying to attach, that it's really one of the fastest to market governance models. You have somebody with clear accountability of control, you have somebody driving results, you have somebody that serves as a legal entity. And so we have lots of examples now of good founder-led models that have gone into production. And the big caveat is, as long as that founder is perceived as a neutral facilitator, or what we sometimes call a benevolent dictator. And then the other model is the consortia-led model. And that's really a good, strong model if you're trying to do things like to develop standards, or if you're trying to do things like develop proof of concepts inside sandboxes. However, consortia are a nightmare if you're trying to launch a live product. You need a legal entity, you want kind of one standard software licensing agreement. So typically what you want to see a consortia do is pivot to a spin-off or a joint venture when they're moving from the sandbox into production. And I'll pause there in case you have any follow-ups or if any of the other panelists want to jump in.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, maybe Jim, I would throw it over to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and how kind of VeriTX plays into the whole aerospace ecosystem. And the aerospace and defense ecosystem is quite complex, and there's all sorts of different organizations in there, right? Some are just massive organizations, but they're also working with much smaller ones when you could start talking about 3D printers or other manufacturers. So how do the dynamics work inside of there, and how do you work through that?
Sure. I mean, that's fundamentally the crux of this conversation as we kind of work outward in concentric circles. I first want to acknowledge Mary's comments. Mary's probably one of the smartest people I've met, and I'm going to brag on her just for a second before I answer the question. But she's written probably up to 30 books by now, Mary. But she's got some very, very good books. She's on her 2nd, I think, on blockchain. But if you haven't picked one up, please do so, because you're going to learn a lot as she unwraps and unpacks these use cases. And one of them is the VeriTX use case. But to what she said before, it's very difficult to start a large corporation and work your way out. And I'm going to highlight it a little bit, but let me walk backwards just to another point she made, which was really around founder-led or consortia-led projects. There's a bias that comes, whether intentional or not, when you have a large corporation. You have whatever your corporation is about. So let's say it's Honeywell and GE. Honeywell and GE are competitors. They're also suppliers to each other and so on. However, I don't think Honeywell would be very comfortable giving their IP to GE, nor GE to Honeywell. So you have to create an environment, especially in the digital world that we're going to work in this Industry 4.0, that allows people to be comfortable. So that neutral space is very, very important. And I'll go back to the Moog story. So we developed this technology, and it was called VeriPart inside of Moog. And Moog is a great company, very innovative. And what we found, though, it was very hard for Moog, the big battleship, to kind of steer towards this blockchain solution because it wasn't part of their core business. And it's very difficult to start a company within a company because every day you're putting out fires regardless of where you are in that company. And those fires of the day seem to always take all the personnel that you would want in the innovative side and putting them into the operational side to solve these problems. So it's very difficult to get things moving and then to really keep any type of momentum you have because there's always something coming up. So ideally you want to come outside of the company A lot of large companies have their own innovative space. JetBlue's got innovative space, Lockheed, Boeing, and so on, so they can be outside. Now for the consortia part. Whether it's founder-based or consortia-based startup, the thing that's most important is it's got to be governance first. And what we found with some of the early blockchain examples with IBM, whether it's TradeLens or Food Trust, was when the governance model wasn't very solid, they didn't have a lot of participation. But they went back, they figured it out, got the governance online, and then all of a sudden these things took off. The other thing to consider when you're looking at these consortia or founder base is where you are in the value chain. And a perfect example is another Arkansas company, Walmart. Walmart said, hey, look, we have all these recalls for leafy lettuce. We're endangering our customers with food safety issues. We're going to put it on blockchain. So they go out to the lettuce growers and say, hey, if you want to participate and sell lettuce at Walmart, you have to be on our blockchain by September 19th. So you have to be on our blockchain by September 19th. What that allows them to do is this rapid forensics in the event that there is an outbreak or a recall of food. So they can do that. Now put yourself on the other end of the value chain to the farmer. Let's say Kroger or Aldi came to them and said, hey, to sell at Kroger or Aldi, you have to be on our blockchain. Or let's say that the guys who sell them fertilizer said, hey, in order to buy my fertilizer, you have to be on my blockchain. So all of a sudden you have all these unfunded mandates that are pushed down to the level that's less likely to be able to afford and implement, which is the grower. You're asking them, to participate. This is a requirement. So it's important as we do this to understand where we are in the value chain. So if you're in the right place of the value chain, you can take bias out or you can put bias in. If you're in the right place of the value chain, you can be a start for governance and good governance. I would say that to Mary's point, you must start with a status quo before you even start with governance. So before you even bring on one partner, it's imperative that you start with a status quo so that you're only making changes. So that's a little bit kind of walking around the issue, but it is difficult. We did come out, VeriTX came outside of Moog in order to create a neutral environment. I will say that we are founder-led, but we will be consortia-based, which is this hybrid model, because aerospace is a consortia of about 15,000 aerospace suppliers. But the reason to do it like that is to, one, establish, as a founder base, to establish status quo that will then be driven to the governance model that the consortia will then participate in. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Jim. That was fantastic. What I would like to get to now is just move through the SSI model. And for folks that are quite familiar with SSI or have seen our presentations before, we've spoken about this model before, but I just want to go through it quickly because I want to tie it back into these B2B use cases or scenarios that we're talking about today. So self-sovereign identity enables this new model called the verifiable credential model, or the verifiable credential trust triangle, which makes data or credential exchange possible in a peer-to-peer fashion without necessarily having an identity service provider facilitating that transaction. So no matter what type of credential you're exchanging, the triangle involves the same three parties. So there's always the issuers, who are the source of credentials. So every credential has an issuer. It has to come from someone. And most, I guess in B2B, you could think about various issuers being government agencies, standard bodies, financial institutions, and so forth. They issue verifiable credentials to a holder. So holders request credentials from them, and then they hold them in their wallet, a digital wallet. And they present them when they need to be presented when there's a verification happening from a verifier. So the verifier being the third kind of actor in this triangle. So a verifier is anyone really that's seeking trust assurance of some kind about the holder of a credential, and the verifiers request credentials and they follow their own policies to verify the authenticity and the validity of those credentials. So a lot of people tend to go to B2C use cases for self-sovereign identity. So a lot of times we think about just an individual holding a driver's license or a passport or something like that inside of their digital SSI wallet. But there's tons of B2B use cases as well where making use of self-sovereign identity and verifiable credentials makes sense. So I want to just go through a quick example, and then I'll throw it back over to Subhashis for a little more of a deeper explanation of the benefits of this being implemented in something like VeriTX or similar B2B use cases. So in this example, we have an issuer, which would be the US Air Force. And we have issuers here because there could actually be multiple issuers within the Air Force. So within the US Air Force, you could have an HR department, for example, that would issue a credential of a new employee or a new contractor. And here, this is what we're looking at, is that the Air Force has multiple issuers internal that are issuing credentials to a contractor that's being hired to do some maintenance work on an airplane. You could think about a chief identity, a security officer, for example, could issue credentials on access to physical or digital assets, for example, as well, right? So all these groups would be using an infrastructure that's powered by self-sovereign identity. So the verifiable credentials are issued and signed by the issuers within the Air Force. And then once the contractor in this case has the different credentials in their wallet, they're able to use these as proofs to perform certain tasks. This is all powered by a blockchain.
No.
So some blockchains are made specific to this use case. Some are general blockchains. Some people use other methods, but a blockchain is used to really guarantee here who issued which piece of information to the holder, if the information was actually issued to the holder themselves, if the information was altered or changed by the holder, and if the information is still valid upon receipt here. So now that we've gone through that, I guess, Subhashis, with all of the solutions that we've built, or a lot of people have been building using distributed technologies such as blockchain, one of the issues has always been user onboarding and user management. So you could have a decentralized or a distributed network, but how could people get themselves onboarded, and how could you turn that into a self-serve type of thing? And it could be for a distributed network, it could be for any type of network. But how do you see self-sovereign identity or verifiable credentials being kind of a key innovation for onboarding processes?
Yes, Matthew. So yeah, sorry about that. So even like today, also people are using credentials. So there are examples of Dun and Bradstreet credit scores. People check before they get engaged in business with other businesses, or if somebody is hiring a contractor, you know, they are also looking at the credentials of the employee who's being sent, right? But the issue today is that most of this is very time consuming, and it is it's paper bound and things like that, which does not allow for frictionless business transaction. What SSI is bringing to the B2B transaction is really making it cost effective and making it frictionless. And other thing which also doing is, because it's all happening digitally, like in the case of aerospace and a lot of other domains, we need traceability and provenance, right? So the kind of things that SSI brings, like when we get credentials, what do we want to do? We should be able to verify them. And we want to verify them in a quick and fast manner. We don't want, the person who's verifying it doesn't want to go to the issuer, find who the issuer is, exchange a ton of papers to do it. What SSI does is allows all of this to happen in a digital format at the speed of internet, because all of this is through exchange of secure message, peer-to-peer secure messages through the SSI framework. The other thing which SSI does, which is very challenging for businesses today, is that they don't want to create honeypot for hackers. So you don't want to store these credentials and all of that in your environment. You really want them to be stored and managed by the person you are doing business with. So there comes the aspect of user management, right? So the truth and the reality is that credentials have life cycle to themselves. They change. Some credentials are issued for life, for example, but some are time bound, and some are, we go through exams. If we take a machine, the machine has to be calibrated at a certain point of time, and we know when it got calibrated, and then it has to be calibrated again. The same is with humans, the same is with business. An ISO certificate has a life to itself. So who is best to manage these credentials? Today, these credentials are stored in enterprises who are using somebody else to do business. Won't it be better that it's held between the issuer and the person whose credential these are? This is what SSI brings, which improves the management of these credentials much better than the way they are being done today. And so it brings, hence it brings a ton of efficiency. And not only that, it saves a lot of money for the businesses, because you're not creating these honeypot of data, which you have to constantly spend money to secure and avoid threats.
Is it a new model? Like, would it, like when we hear bring your own ID and stuff like that, I guess that's what would lead into this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is absolutely, it's a new way of conducting business, and it's possible because of the evolution in technology today. So it is revisiting how businesses have been conducted in a more secure and a more frictionless and in a more robust manner.
Fantastic. Part 3 is about identity and access management. So I guess back to Jim. I would love to go after this section to go back to you, Mary. We kind of touched on the quality of issuers here, and I'd like to go back to that after. But just for a second, going back to Jim within the aerospace industry. There's all sorts of skilled workers that are being employed and being contracted to buy and sell parts or do repairs on parts. So it's kind of one thing where it's a complex landscape, but there's also a lot of complexity in aerospace, like there is in a lot of other industries. But in aerospace, it's compliance, compliance, compliance. There's so many laws, so many standards, so many things need to be taken into consideration. So with a complex ecosystem like that, how does VeriTX kind of fit in the middle here and deal with access management between different organizations?
Thanks, Matthew. I think it's important when we do this to kind of, if we can frame this up contextually. For me, all value is derived from whatever the asset is. So when I look at value, I start at where the asset is, and I work my way all the way back. So again, this right to left type of framework. All right, so the value chain matters, whether it's people, machines, or processes. So in order to have a clear digital workflow, we need to have SSI for all parts of the value chain in order to ensure trust and value from part. So for us, is with VeriTX and in aerospace, it really reduces that coefficient of friction. But more importantly, it creates a second order effect that's extremely important, especially in aerospace. If you have an escape, or let's say you manufacture something and you made an error, you're a couple hundredths off on a part and you didn't catch it. So you need to figure out kind of what that sample size of that error is going to be. Now, because you have this value chain with SSI all the way through it from end to end, you can very quickly do rapid forensics and get down to a sample size and understand exactly what the magnitude of the problem is. So let's go back to, let's say somebody was measuring something wrong. You were then shipping those parts to an airframer, and a couple of them then went out to airplanes. Now, it might not have created a safety issue where the plane would fall out, but it is enough of an issue that it wasn't built to the specification. Companies spend 6, 9, 12 months trying to figure out what the magnitude of its escape is and really do root cause analysis. But by having this reduced coefficient of friction all the way from the part all the way back into the design to the original requirement and traceable, you can very quickly neck down the sample size that you're after. I think that's the value that we start to see. So when you look at what SSI does in these complex environments, is it reduces the friction it puts a level of expediency that has never been experienced. Things are done in paper in aerospace, you know, faxes, emails, phone calls. But now all of a sudden you have data. And out of that data, you can also create aggregable, I hate saying that word, aggregable data sets that will lead you to prescriptive and predictive maintenance models, because you're able to now collect this metadata. These are the things that we're missing. This is the value that's being created. And Mary talks a lot about Internet of Value. This is the Internet of Value. It's that exchange of data and information in a frictionless environment that's traceable right to the individual person, machine, bag of powder in the case of 3D print, design engineer in the case of I need to change the basic design, form, fit, and function of the part. You can get these traces done very quickly. And in a sense, you can also create a much safer ecosystem for production.
And I love you mentioned the right to left there a couple times, starting with the assets. Like that, we think that's really key, especially when we start talking about access management for an enterprise. It's difficult. It's difficult to secure all your assets, especially when you have all sorts of different assets in all sorts of different shapes and forms. And security for a company is just not limited to your four walls anymore, right? It's tough to put perimeters or to put walled gardens around your assets. You know, your applications could be on-prem, they could be in private clouds. A lot of companies are using multi-cloud approaches. They could be with partners. You could have various ecosystems of contractors, partners, customers, employees as a whole thing. How your assets are being accessed through, your digital assets are being accessed through devices. It could be your company's devices or public devices or IoT devices. And we're not even talking about physical access here too, where we're not even taking into consideration access to physical spaces, which should fall within a convergence strategy. So it really is that right to left approach that the focus needs to be on securing assets, right? And using verifiable credentials and self-sovereign identity allows you to do that, where you don't necessarily have that explosion of roles anymore. You don't have to be defining every roles within your perimeter. You just need to secure your assets and let the verifiable credentials do the work.
No, you're absolutely right. I just spent the last 2 days, and I'll be on after this and tomorrow, leading a DoD discussion with about 400 civilians and military about how you can push a part from somebody's basement because they're working at home on Zoom and they made a change to a part and they want to push it out to an airplane that's out to an aircraft carrier or a forward operating base. How do you do that? And then, oh, by the way, your enemy who's going to try to spoof this. So SSI for us is part of that fortified pipe, but your enemy is going to try to spoof it and attack it with the same vigor that he would a physical supply chain. So this is just one more element that's required in order for us to have that trust. I'll pause.
Yeah, I completely agreed. And you know, there's data breaches or hacks don't always come directly through you, right? It could happen through partners, systems or networks, or using partner credentials. So it's really, you need to be thinking a little broader about asset protection. And that's how we've been thinking about it with VeriTX. And I guess Subhashis, could you briefly just explain kind of an example of how we're using verifiable credentials to secure assets inside the aerospace industry with VeriTX here?
Yeah, great points, and I'd like to cover a couple of things here. Yes, it's all about looking right to left and the asset. And see, there are many use cases like the triangle you have here. Like in this case, like if we take an example of Boeing, for example, taking a Moog part and wants to get 3D printed through a 3D bureau, one of the things that the 3D bureau would like to know is whether Boeing has digital rights to the part and whether it has been issued, whether it has been, and without going to Moog wants to verify that thing, right? So that type of a flow is extremely important. And the other thing that SSI enables, I want to also mention, is that It's not that this triangle is fixed, where Moog is always the issuer and Boeing is always the holder, and the 3D part is always the verifier. The whole thing can change. Where, for example, if Boeing wants to go to the 3D printer company and wants to verify whether the part has been printed correctly or not, it needs to bring certain credentials like a Boyd, which can be verified by the 3D printer company. So these diagrams can constantly change, and what SSI enables is that you can constantly change who is where in this triangle, and you're not tying things with a hard-bound role. You mentioned about role explosion. In the traditional solutions today, these roles are getting very hard-bound, and they're spending a ton of money trying to manage this. So we need flexibility in this architecture where people can change their roles. They can be holders sometimes, they can be verifiers sometimes, they may become issuers sometimes. And depending upon the business transaction, I can change these roles. That is extremely important in a B2B environment. Extremely, extremely important to provide that flexibility of architecture. The other thing that you and Jim mentioned was looking from right to left. The value of the marketplace is in the assets. And the second thing which is extremely important is that value is built by the truth about that asset. This is what is enabled through trust and verifiable credentials, where we don't provide access to assets and transactions which are conducted without verifying each and every one who is trying to access. So it's extremely important to make sure that the data is immutable, the transactions are immutable, and who are accessing are verified every time using the verifiable credentials that they are carrying.
Fantastic. Yeah, it really gives that flexibility to allow anyone to scale and not be bogged down by overhead of managing all these different business transactions. So thank you for that great explanation, Subhashis. This is the last part of the webinar. Excited for this one. It'd be good if we could make this a little more conversational, because there's a lot of good stuff when we spoke about this a few days ago that came out. But Mary, I would love to start with you. You wrote a white paper earlier this year, I think you published in January, about a specific project that was issuing verifiable credentials, or allowing people to issue verifiable credentials or verified data as proofs of various degrees or certifications in order to try to remove fraud of people applying for jobs with a fraudulent university degree or a fraudulent certification as a contractor and so forth. Could you talk to us a bit about that model and a little bit about, and that takes us on the left side where we're talking about protecting assets in this previous part, but this is really, there's quite a lot of importance on the left side as well, and the issuers and where the actual verifiable data is coming from. So would you mind just explaining the project and just some of that stuff?
Matthew, you know what would help the discussion? Can you go back to your generic triangle? Because then we can walk around the triangle. So as Matthew said, the University of Arkansas was is a member of a consortia that is focused on what's called a SMART resume. That is a founder-led model by a company called Adafy out of Little Rock, Arkansas. And what this company is trying to do is fix job acquisition. So right now, I was really surprised to learn about all this, but right now, 80% of companies use job sites like LinkedIn, and there's lots of problems with this. First of all is fraudulent claims of your credentials, right? None of us nobody ever checks whatever whatever we write on our LinkedIn profiles. And even at the University of Arkansas, we have more people claiming degrees from our university than have ever learned them. So we have that issue of fraudulent claims on credentials. We also have problems with job hiring companies because there's a lot of bias in job hiring. So if you're using these kind of websites like a Monster or LinkedIn, you can look at a lot of personal identifiable information. You can see somebody's race, you can see their age. So how do you get job selection bias out of that? So Dave Wengel, who's CEO of Idatify, came up with this idea of a smart resume where the issuers are the only ones that are authorized to issue credentials. And that holder that you see here, that's an individual resume holder. And that individual resume holder is going to have credentials from lots of different institutions. So it could be the University of Arkansas. It could be you went through an IBM training module. It could be you're a qualified forklifter. And what the platform does, it'll collect all the certified credentials and present it as a smart resume. And then the job hiring companies, when they do searches for talent, they only search based on the credentials they need. They don't have any personal identifiable information about the applicant until the applicant chooses to reveal it. And so they've been on a great journey. They've got 60,000 smart resumes launched. If you're a student at the University of Arkansas, every one of our students will be issued a smart resume credential from the university upon graduation. And we also issue credentials like if you were on Leadership Walton, or if you were an honors student, or you got the Chancellor's Award for Excellence. So it's a phenomenal model. It's taken a long time to build the ecosystem. I'd say that was the much bigger challenge rather than the technology challenge. And it's a blockchain enabled solution because the credentials are secured and stored on a blockchain. So I'm going to pause there in case you have any questions or comments or follow-ups.
I guess that this type of thing becomes quite important too, as it's a starter, right? But you could start using this stuff for provenance and traceability, as you have basically verified or quality data that starts to become, I guess, part of a larger journey. And if you have more of this stuff, the provenance and the traceability becomes something that has a lot of value.
Yeah, I think the big value really is creating that neutral marketplace. Because if you just even think about from the perspective of from like the University of Arkansas, every time one of our alumni changes jobs, the registrar gets an office from the new employer trying to verify their credential. So what the Smart Resume platform's trying to do is to prevent that phone call in the first place. The individual job applicant can just prove that they have this credential from them. So I think that's one of the value adds from the credentialing side. From the individual resume holders perspective, I think the Smart Resume project did a lot of smart things. They said you have to determine who should pay for this and who's getting value out of it. And so the decision they made is not to charge credentialing organizations. So they're not charging like the University of Arkansas to do this. They're not charging the individual resume holders who tend to be like recent graduates and students. So their business model is in this ecosystem, the companies who are the ones that get the most value out of it, because they're the ones that are going to get certified credentialed job applicants, and the companies will be able to prove that they're not doing any kind of bias selection. So I think it's really important when you're trying to build this trusted marketplace that you really have to bounce around and understand the value proposition is going to be different for each participant in the ecosystem, and you have to think about the behavioral and financial incentives to get everyone in the ecosystem to join and trust it.
Yeah, the other thing, Mary, also is that the holder is also benefiting, because in this example, as I change my jobs, for example, I don't need every employer to contact University of Arkansas, because I already have a verifiable credential. So the value is on both sides, right? Like you were saying, that the holder is getting benefit because it's creating an ecosystem. As I travel, I can reuse my credential without any concern. And the enterprise is getting value that they don't have to chase issuers to verify the credentials.
Right. And Subhashis and Jim, you both mentioned this speed of onboarding, right? It takes on average 3 or 4 weeks to verify credentials for a new hire. And this is, as you say, it's instantaneous. I've proven to you I have my credentials.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're kind of we're skipping around kind of what kind of connects all this, whether you're the holder, the issuer, the verifier, excuse me. It's about reputation. So if you're the holder, you have a reputation of whatever your credential leads, and you're honest. If you are the issuer, you're issuing, credentials to folks that earned them, and so on. But the company itself now has a reputation of, hey, come here to find reputable hires. And the company that hires, hey, we use a system that takes bias out. So we are using a very fair system for our hiring, and so on. So as you think out in concentric circles from the person to the hiring organization to the to the organization that's going to put the candidates together, and then out to the hiring organizations, you have these concentric circles of reputation that are very important. The most important piece is, if that reputation gets soiled, it's going to be extremely hard to recover, right? So whether you're a person or whether you're the organization that collectively puts people in front of to the market, if you're the marketplace for people, or if you're a company that all of a sudden there's bias that's put into the decision. And I think that's crucial at the human level and also at the parts and manufacturing level. So reputation is really the most important thing for me coming out of the discussion today. Is how do you establish a reputation? I'll pause there.
And I think you could do stuff of whether it's zero knowledge proofs or homomorphic encryption, where I'm not sure, Mary, if that was touched upon in the project too, but just removing as much bias as possible from the whole exchange process and the decisioning process.
I'm sorry, I was reading the Q&A, Matthew. If you're addressing something to me, you got to repeat.
I was reading the Q&A as well, and there's someone that brought up a question about selection bias. And so that's what I was trying to address. If the project you worked on addressed those types of biases, and I know there are technical ways of doing so through various encryptions. I was just wondering if that was something that was taken into consideration.
I think that's one of the major value adds to the hiring organization. So if you look at the Smart Resume interface, when you are the job hiring company, you are only looking at a generic unique candidate ID and their list of qualifications. So you don't see a picture of them, you don't know their race, you don't know their age, you don't know any of the other things that we routinely can discern from places like a Monster or a LinkedIn. So that is one of the main, that's a huge issue, as Jim points out, in reputation and hiring. So they don't get to see any of that. So if
and
they're interested
too. I'm sorry, Mary. Yeah,
okay,
promotion.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, and in promotion boards too, like in the DoD, we've taken pictures out so that you can't have bias and so on. Although there are some demographics that work in, but this permeates through all those different areas, as you're going to mention. And I apologize for interrupting you.
No, that's absolutely great. I think some of the challenges when you're trying to do something like this is you have to kind of uplift large numbers in order to make it worthwhile. So I think the Smart Resume project, they didn't really talk to hiring companies until the end, right? Because the hiring companies need to see a viable marketplace, a viable ecosystem of lots of individual resume holders. So Dave Wengel started off primarily focusing on the issuers of the credentials, and then launching the smart resumes, educating the receivers of these smart resumes, how they activate them, and the holders have complete control of their smart resumes. Identify doesn't control it. Nobody, it's the individual resume holders. They will decide, yes, I want to be visible in the market. And if a hiring company wants to pursue them forward, they have to give permission to reveal additional levels of information. So it really empowers the individual resume holders, which is one of the reasons why we were excited to participate in this particular use case.
Exactly. Like this is where SSI is so great, because it gives control to the owner of the data to decide, what do I want to share with whom for which transaction. It's such a powerful change in paradigm, and it's good for both sides, right? Why do you want to have information that you really don't care about? And if the holder doesn't want to share it, all the power to them, because ultimately it's their information and it should be their choice. So this is great.
I'm just reading through some of the questions here. So there was one was asking about the issuance of organizational level IDs as opposed to personal. How is a personal ID tied to an organizational ID? So there are organizations that are issuing legal identity identifiers. They're not a requirement, but as the whole space gets a little more robust, you're going to have different levels of assurances behind credentials, and likely organizations that have legal identity identifiers is going to be a starting point of having higher levels of trust or of assurance. And then that could trickle downwards where the organization and the governance within an organization could start issuing credentials out to their employees, to vendors and partners and stuff like that. So it's going to be all mixed together. And like Subhashis mentioned earlier, everyone's a holder, everyone's going to be an issuer, everyone's going to be a verifier. It just depends on what the specific use case is. But the important thing is that you're in control of your data and what's happening. And we have a couple minutes left, so just one other question I thought I would touch upon. Maya asks, why do you think blockchain verifiable credentials haven't been considered as the innovative tools yet in general? What can we do to make mass adoption more possible to the world? So I guess, Mary, that would go back to a lot of the stuff we were talking about earlier, where it's just, it's not the easiest thing working in collaborative environments. Like there are solutions to it, and you've described a bunch of them, but it really comes down to collaboration and policies and governance in an ecosystem concept.
Yeah, I think also a lot of the early blockchain-enabled solutions we're seeing, they were focused on, industry verticals, solving problems within industry verticals, and this all becomes, credentials become something they think about later. But what I think is so important, and why the University of Arkansas has chosen to join the Trust Over IP Foundation, is we got to have eyeballs on this horizontal layer. Right, that we're not going to get to a seamless internet of value until we do this. And so I think having something like the Trust Over IP I hope is going to be the place where we really focus and bring all of the other initiatives in SSI together, create the governance stack in addition to the technology stack to help solve this. So we're excited to participate in it.
Yeah, second that. I was going to mention the Trust Over IP as being kind of a great source of thought leadership and information for those who are interested in learning more about self-sovereign identity and that whole governance and tech stack. We're very happy to be part of that. There is a learning curve. It's complex. Like, we're glad to have conversations with folks if you're looking to learn more about this stuff. But I would say the Trust Over IP is a great starter because it covers everything very horizontally and gives you a good understanding and brings together a bunch of different standards and technologies from all over the place. Although it's technology agnostic, it's just trying to make it more of a standards and governance driven framework before even having conversations about technology. So I would suggest checking out, I think it's trustoverip.org, or just Google Trust Over IP. If not, reach out to us. We love having these conversations. So I think that wraps it up. We hit the hour mark. I want to thank our guests today. Mary, thank you very much. And Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. We very much enjoyed your insights in this conversation. Hopefully we could do it again at some point.